All right, welcome everyone to episode 26 of Somebody Asked Me with Janice Case. We are really excited, of course, to be back for a second week in a row to continue our conversation that's really focused on how to be anti-racist in everyday life and, of course, at larger levels within the context of our communities. But before we get started, I am joined again today by my friends Melissa Ellis and Henri Williams. So why don't we just start by friends, how are you? Melissa, you're exhausted. That's how you are, right?
That's how I am. Yes. I'm exhausted, but I'm good. I've fallen into the I guess the semi self quarantined routine that we've been in since March of last year. At least I've been in since March of last year. I'm actually enjoying like working from home. I've developed a pretty routine workout schedule outdoors, so I don't feel so trapped in the home. I know listeners may have remembered in the beginning I struggled a bit with finding my flow and all that. I feel like I found it and I actually prefer it. I still want COVID gone, of course. I want to get back to a more normal way of life. I won't say the normal way of life because that's what got us where we are. But I'm doing well. I can't complain other than a little insomnia, making a sister tired, but that's about it. Yeah, that's the only complaint I have.
That's fair. I'm glad to hear that. How about you, Henri? And Henri, tell people where you are, because I don't know that we've told people where you are geographically.
Oh, so I'm in Kinderhook, New York, which is roughly, let's say 20 miles outside of Albany,
Okay.
between Albany and Hudson, New York, you know. Supposedly no, not supposedly, the home of President Martin Van Buren. At least that's its claim to fame. Sorry for that.
Oh no.
Thanks.
Well, it's interesting because, because of that, there's all these historical things and, buildings
Hmm.
and it's interesting. I like history. So I visited these things and the thing is my older daughters went to school around here. And back in the day when they did school trips, they visited the Schuyler Mansion, the whole Hamilton connection, their father, we visited their mansion because that's in Albany and all these other historical sites. So it was interesting when I saw Hamilton, I'm like, oh yeah. And they talked about this Hudson River connection, and the towns that they were referencing. It's like, oh yeah, I've
Okay.
seen those places. But sorry for the sidebar. Other than that, I'm doing okay. Yesterday went to daughter number three's baby shower. So granddaughter
Congrats.
is coming in, I guess, a couple of weeks, the way it sounds.
Daughter, right?
Like Scott, excuse me?
Oh no, second granddaughter. So it'll be two granddaughters, right? And then okay.
Yep, so I have two current granddaughters. This will be granddaughter number three and one grandson.
Okay.
Okay.
I got you. You're way ahead of me, man. My kid's got to get going. All right. Into the challenge. We got to get going.
It's nice. Grandparenting is really, it's different. And it's interesting because just to kind of tie things in back and forth. One of the things I'm finding myself do is as we are reading and discussing aspects of the book, I find myself going back and forth with my history, my experience, and my children's experiences, and how do these things affect or play out, so to speak. So it's just fascinating, because I saw them yesterday, and and we're doing this currently, and I'm like, oh, I could see some of that.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to hearing how some of that, like you said, becomes even more a part of our conversation. So thank you for that. So let me set the stage for everybody. For those of you who listened to episode 25, and if you didn't, I'm going to encourage you to go back and do that. We ended that episode with this idea from Ibram Kendi, whose book "How to Be an Anti-Racist" is is the kind of basis, if you will, for our learning right now in our conversations. And this quote from the book goes like this: that racist ideas have defined our society since its beginning and can feel so difficult and obvious as to be banal. But anti-racist ideas remain difficult to comprehend, in part because they go against the flow of this country's history. He goes on to say, we've all been programmed to respond to the human difference between us with fear and loathing, and to handle that difference in one of three ways: ignore it, and if that's not possible, copy it if we think it's dominant, or destroy it if we think it's subordinate. So our intention then with this podcast is to disrupt that pattern that he identifies and to create patterns for relating across our human differences as equals. We're going to pick up the thread this week by focusing on two key ideas, the idea of dueling consciousness and the idea of power. So with that in mind, let's get to it. I want to kick us off by returning to three key terms that round out our conversation about vocabulary, because last time, of course, we spent the bulk of our time really thinking about the important vocabulary that we're going to need to have some common understanding around. And just like all the really tough terms that we explored last week, let's make sure we have a common understanding of these. So for our listeners, Kendi defines three key terms here: assimilationist, which is defined as someone who is expressing the racist idea that a racial group is culturally or behaviorally inferior and is supporting cultural or behavioral enrichment programs to develop that racial group. So my educator hat goes to in schools, it's this idea that that this group is lesser and therefore but if we do these things, we can fix them, basically, essentially, is my quick translation of that. Segregationist is someone who is expressing the racist idea that a permanently inferior racial group can never be developed. Excuse me. Supporting policy that separates away that racial group. And then lastly, he talks about, of course, and we did discuss this last week, anti-racist, one who is expressing the idea that racial groups are equals and none needs developing, and a supporting policy that reduces racial inequity. So with those three in mind, Melissa and Henri, right out of the gate, I would love to just get your sense of those terms, anything that you feel like would be important to clarify for people around those terms, etc. So, and Henri, why don't you just jump in? How about that?
Oh, okay. It's interesting because, I actually probably went through that chapter a few times for various reasons. I wanted to really capture what he was trying to say, yeah, and then trying to put it into some kind of perspective. So as an example, so I would like to believe we all understand what he meant by segregationist. Yeah. And just for the sake of discussion, I think over the last 4 years, in some of the demonstrations we've seen in our nation, we have people who still hold on to this idea of separation is, I don't know, maybe the solution, or that's what they want to accomplish. Right. What I found fascinating was the assimilationists or assimilation. And so I wanted, I'd like to say probably growing up, as a, person of color in New York City, and thinking about my family, there was certainly probably aspects of that. I do remember aspects of that, meaning your behavior being perceived through the eyes of white people and this conforming to a certain behavior, so you're not seen as different or not conforming, let's say, so to speak. And then, and I think about when I went to college, I wanted to be a sociologist. And, these were terms that were bantered around, you know, integration, assimilation, you know, segregation, you know, and the whole concept of how society comes together based on, you know, how these terms are looked at, viewed, and applied. But, you know, I want to now offer this thought, and maybe I'm jumping ahead, because if you think about this whole argument, and it's not really an argument, of race as a social construct, you need to start off with race as a social construct to, at least I think, better understand these terms. Because there is no differences between the races, you know. We now know through DNA profiling, we're 99.9% similar. You know, the only differences are facial features and skin tone, things like that. I don't think anyone needing a heart transplant is worrying about whether their heart came out of a Latino or Black person or a white person. Let's just cut to the chase. But if you start off with the premise of race being a social construct, and within that construct, prioritizing who is at the top of the pyramid, so to speak, then assimilationists make sense, because everyone's behavior then is viewed as white standard, and anything that falls outside, you know, is, let's just say, maybe not okay, not acceptable. So, and what he purports, and I certainly see this, is an assimilationist buys into this idea that anything outside of this white construct isn't good or as good, and the conformity is to then follow or abide by this construct. And, you know, when I thought about it, you know, it really goes beyond race, you know, this whole idea of assimilationists, you know, because we do that in the workforce too, you know, men and women. But it's basically buying into this concept that we aren't equal. So when you buy into this whole assimilist argument, you're also buying into the idea that there are differences, we aren't equal, and in order to, let's say, get along, you know, or be successful, you have to assimilate to this construct. Versus the racist model, which basically accepts the idea we're all the same. You know, there's nothing attributable to your race, you know, or things of that nature, or you need to conform to be like this person or that person. So, you know, that's kind of my takeaway, my thought about it, which for me is a shift, because I don't think I often thought success for me was to assimilate in the idea that I wanted to model this construct. I certainly got to the place of, you know, success needing to, let's say, get along, but I don't, you know, I don't think I compromised to the point of not being myself. And, you know, and I attribute that a lot to, I think, what he says in his book, your family, you know, and your upbringing. And, you know, and he talks a little later about this whole power construct, where you go to school, who educates you, you know, and in some ways, maybe I was kind of lucky in that regard. But yeah. So yeah, that's my takeaway.
I appreciate that, and Melissa, I'm going to come to you in just a second, but I want to. You took us down a couple of different entry points, if you will, Henri, and so I want to build on a couple of them. So you obviously, I agree with you that understanding the kind of social construct that is race is an important piece as we move forward. And so one of the things that I really valued about this part of our reading together is Kenny goes into the history of some of these pieces, right? And so for me, a new learning was this idea that, and he kind of says it this way. He says race is fundamentally a power construct. So it's a social construct, as you're saying, but for the purposes of power, right? And he actually goes into the history of the very first time race, the idea of race, if you will, was introduced back in the 1400s, which was fascinating for me. And of course, that's tied very specifically to the onset of the slave trade. And so, and he goes all the way back to the actual person who first introduced a construct that then led to over 100 years, kind of even the science world, if you will, jumping on and saying, yes, that's exactly right. You have people of these four different colors, if you will, and based on their color, these are the characteristics you can attribute to them. And then, of course, that it in its in of itself becomes a power structure. And for myself, that was that was one of those things where I was kind of like, I kind of knew that, but I didn't know it in this way. And it really then influences how I understand, especially this idea of assimilationist. And it does make me realize, like, gosh, when you think about the history of this country, and there's a period of time that not to say that it stopped and started, but that it was this idea of assimilation was strongest, and it was considered very positive, right? Because it was almost like we're accepting, right? We're accepting of. Versus this lens and realizing that the idea of assimilation in and of itself is so extremely such an extremely racist idea, because it does suggest somebody's got to get fixed, because there's a standard to which everybody has to live to, versus, as you said, that we're all just the same, right? And so therefore there is no standard. Melissa, what are you thinking? Melissa's either talking on mute. There she is. It's okay. That's our world, man.
That's the way it works, especially when you're hiding from a bunch of kids in your car. But I would say for me, the thought was more so, I wasn't so much interested in the definitions of those words, although I know that it's important to clarify them because not everybody has the same understanding that I do. But for me, I was instantly transformed to my own experiences with having to assimilate, and how little I think people think about that, for especially people who are not of color. I don't think that they even realize how ingrained that is in a lot of people of color, and the things that we are expected to do, even if it's not said, just expected to do. For a very long time, I wore locks, which a lot of people refer to as dreadlocks. I hate that word, so I just say locks. I had locks for about 8 years working for the federal government. And it was very interesting, the different reactions I got from something as simple as my hair, the way it grew out of my head. Yeah. How the comments that I received, the looks that I received, things like that, wearing head wraps, wearing certain outfits, if they had any kind of cultural ties, those things are expected to just be removed. That's not a part of the workplace. When it's a part of my life, it's a part of who I am. So assimilation is something that I just feel like is not talked about enough in this country. It's certainly not something that I think enough people are aware of. They just expect it. They just expect that we should be like them, even though we're completely different. And I just, there's so much we could talk about around that topic alone. So I don't want to get too really heavy into it. I just kind of wanted to bring out the idea that if you're listening right now and that's not something you've ever thought of, think of it, like research it, start paying attention, because it's a big part of the lives of people of color. It's something that we sometimes aren't aware that that's what we're doing. We're not even aware that we're doing it. We're not aware that it's a belief we hold. We don't understand that certain things that we believe and think are because of the way our parents dealt with wanting us to fit in and wanting us to believe a certain way and behave a certain way. I think really quickly, just to give a quick example, and I know that we had talked about that, but one of the ones that gets me is, I know that as a parent, I did this often to my son, being in public, because people expect children of color to be unruly and to be, not well behaved, that I would often stifle him being a child, just being a child, because I was worried about how people would view me as a parent, him as a Black boy. And so I'd stifle him while watching white children behave horribly and nobody say or think anything of it. And so I'm sitting here making him sit still and be quiet and behave, and not even just allowing him to go play with maybe some toys in the doctor's office or something like that. And it wasn't until I started peeling back the layers of the onion that I realized that that's exactly what that is. That's assimilation, that's being worried about what people think of us, but it's all through the lens of white America. It's all through the lens of what white America finds acceptable, or being concerned about what white America will think of us as people of color. Because for some reason, and I know we've talked about this before, but for some reason, the world, or at least in America, we've accepted that the white standard is the standard for all things, for behavior, for education, for beauty, and so assimilation is so woven into all of that. It's woven into our everyday lives, down to the smallest little detail, like how we wear our hair. And I just want people to really be aware of that and be cognizant of that, and combat that at every opportunity.
Well, and he does, he actually very directly says, and we're saying this, right, that assimilationist ideas are, in fact, of in themselves racist ideas.
Absolutely.
And for the reasons that you both have said, right, because you're placing one kind of group, if you will, as superior. And interestingly enough, Melissa, you said for some reason we've decided that white standards are the standard. And what I appreciate about this work, and I'll encourage others to come read it directly for themselves, is that he threads it all the way back to the history of it, right? It's not by accident.
Right.
You can quite concretely thread it all the way back through history and how deliberate and intentional it has been, right? And of course, the argument being made here that is so crystal clear is that it has everything to do with power. But you're starting to get into this idea of dueling consciousness. So let's go ahead and spend some time there, right? This idea of how we, as the dueling consciousness of white people, the dueling consciousness of people of color, and what that means to you. And Henri, I remember when we had our initial conversation around this a few weeks ago, you spoke to really your experiences and your reflections now about this idea, the role of dueling consciousness. And you shared already that you of course were you were kind of like the author's parent as far as the timing, right, of your life, that you had similar experiences with respect to being active in the 60s and then being able to kind of reflect on his sharing through your own experience, because you've actually had some of those experiences. But so I'm interested in hearing you share a little bit about this idea of dueling consciousness for folks.
Well, and something you were saying about social construct, power construct, and Melissa kind of jarred this to me too. This whole idea, as you're saying, goes back historically before America. And as we were talking, it popped into my head. I don't know if you remember this in school. This defining worldwide Mongoloid, Caucasian, Negroid, and he kind of defines it as white, black, red, yellow, and so this was a long time construct, but you needed the social construct to then develop the power construct, of necessary, let's now categorize people, and now let's say put some hierarchy to that categorization, which then allows the power, and so I guess when I think about that and the assimilationists, the impact to me, and he talks a little about this, is policy, and the bigger world of how this affects us in our day-to-day existence. So if you think about things that have been brought about, laws, policies, enactment, are they truly brought about to let's just say, uh, value the person as an equal individual, or we want you to somehow figure out how to be more like us, just to put it simply that way. And I don't necessarily see that as a America thing more than we are in America. So we can certainly talk about our experiences in America. And we know that's, and we've seen that in terms of things, we've referenced dress, behavior. Um, let's talk about competency testing, SATs, intelligence testing. We all know those things have been biased based on how you see that test being constructed through what lens, and so in order to succeed in that test, you have to buy into this assimilationist kind of idea in some way, shape, or form, which doesn't see people as equal. So I guess it's, one of the things that this reading is reminding me of is the impact to policy and the things that affect our daily life. And, that's because of the other work I'm doing. And like right now, we're negotiating to pilot an assessment tool with some local health departments. And what's key about this assessment tool is getting away from these old models and truly getting at, what is happening with the people, making something that's kind of competent, looking at it, let's just say a competency tool that is anti-racist. Looks at the world as everyone being equal. And it's interesting. And I'll, turn it over from here, because I think he kind of touched on this too. This whole idea of, and these are my words, but let's say trying to achieve race neutrality, where we really don't do this, the categorization or thinking this way. And I don't know if this is what he was implying, but it almost felt like, while that might be true or ideal, we're stuck with the model we have, because to do away with some of those things doesn't allow us to then quantify the effects that is happening due to the segregationist or the assimilationist policies, So it's kind of it's an interesting perspective. While in some ways you want to move forward, in some ways you need to hold on to some aspects of this to help with the undoing, or the identification of, if that makes sense to any of you.
No, it does, and that's a really good way to put it, because I think I agree with you that it would be tempting to say, okay, we're just gonna move forward and do better, and as you said, for example, with creating an assessment, do so in an anti-racist way, but all of that can only be done if we are keeping the history in mind. And one thing that he says over and over again that I think is a line that we can't share enough is this idea that we as Americans have been trained to see the deficiency of people rather than policy. That it is intentional that we are trained to look at deficits in others, because it distracts us from paying attention to the policy that is established, has well been established, and continued efforts to be established. And our current battle over a national minimum wage is a great example of that. This idea that if we focus on people, we can distract you from the policy that actually is in and of itself designed to be either assimilationist in nature or racist in nature, right? And to uphold racist standards. So, and he does something else that I want to flesh out a little bit that you said. He talks about, when he's talking about dueling consciousness, he talks about it kind of being created in this way. He says, the white body defines the American body. That's what we've done, right, over time in this country. The white body defines the American body. The white body segregates the black body from the American body. The white body instructs the black body to assimilate into the American body. The white body rejects the black body assimilating into the American body, and therefore the duel continues, right? Like it's this vicious cycle of here's the standard, here are the things we're going to try to assimilate everybody into meeting that standard, and yet we have policies really that are set up that intentionally reject others from reaching that standard. And so then you just kind of continue. And when Kenny talks about his own parents, he talks about them, being and Henri, you said this yourself, like you could remember experiencing the Black is Beautiful movement, if you will. And then as you got older, and he talks about this with his parents, as they start a family and start to have children and they work it themselves into the middle class, suddenly they're looking at themselves, not even suddenly, but gradually over time, they realize they're looking at themselves through both the Black is Beautiful lens of themselves, but also the lens, Melissa, you were starting to get to this, of how others see us, right? And constantly thinking about, wait a minute, how am I being viewed through the white lens? Because I don't want Black people in general to be looked negatively upon by others because of what I'm doing right now, if it's not meeting the standards set by the white lens. So, and in saying all that out loud, I'm like, gosh, that can sound really convoluted because it's not simple, right? It is complex. But then he talks about like living and breathing that, right? Both his parents and then for himself, like the just the energy that goes into constantly living, trying to live up to, if you will, both of those lenses. What do you think?
Well, one thing you said that kind of resonated with me, he talks about his parents. And these are my words, but he kind of made this reference to them buying into this whole idea and going into the corporate world. And mom, rather than being I forget a world traveler, and dad a poet, something to that effect, they go into the corporate world. Well, certainly I can resonate with that. My parents did the same thing. But, think of it, and I thought about it from a different perspective. And if you look at this from this construct that we've been talking about from the beginning, if his parents were white, would they have had the opportunity to pursue those kind of pursuits and been supported in the community or in the greater society by nature of, oh, wow, isn't that great? You want to pursue X, Y, and Z. But based on this notion of social construct, racism, opportunity, how one is viewed, was that even an option for them versus in some ways, and maybe, and they didn't completely buy in because, as we see, they made decisions based on what was optimal for their son and his education. But in some ways, yeah. And I kind of torn with that because I think about myself and, some of the decisions you made, were they so much, falling in line with this assimilationist, let's say, concept versus what are the options available to me given the construct that we live in America? I mean, you talked about minimum wage. The first thing I heard about minimum wage when the discussion came up was, oh, how is this going to affect Black youth in the Black community? I mean, come on. We aren't the majority in America. Just to put myself in that category for the moment. There's a lot more white people in America. How do you think it's going to affect them? Please.
Exactly.
That's such a great example of distracting the general population by focusing on people versus the policy, right? And the long-term potential impact
Mhm.
of the policy. What do you think, Melissa?
Well, it just we talk about policy. We say that on this podcast, and because we want people to focus on the fact that racism is built into the policies of this country. But I don't even think everybody's aware of how deeply ingrained, or even what some of these policies are. And like some of them are blatantly racist. For example, for a very long time, and I mentioned hair earlier, so I'm going back to hair, but hair might seem very simple to some people. But when the way your hair grows out of your head is not allowed in schools through policy, is not allowed in workplaces through policy.
Right.
It's ridiculous, but it's so ingrained that nobody thinks about it. No, like these things are just becoming fights. Well, I don't want to say just becoming fights, but people are just becoming publicly aware of this fight for Black children to be able to wear locks in school and walk across the stage to graduate. Like there's literal stories of Black children who have afros or locks being told that they can't graduate high school despite having done everything they're supposed to do to graduate high school, but being restricted from it because of their hair and policy. Like it's backed up by policy. And so I really want people to pay attention to that and be aware of that. The fact that dueling consciousness is forced upon us. It's not even something all the time that we're trying to do or that we want to do. Sometimes when you hear the word assimilation, you think that's something we're choosing to do. We're choosing to behave more like. But no, in a lot of cases, we aren't given the choice. We're restricted from doing it. We're prohibited from doing it, even if we wanted to. So the policy piece is very, very important. And so as I'm listening to Henri speak, and he, every time we say the word policy, that thought jumps in my head, like, do you even know how deeply that runs, how much it is, within policy? And that's just one of, I picked hair because I think it's something most people can identify with and understand, but it's so much bigger than that. Like you said, it's the testing, it's the school to prison pipeline. It's so heavy, and it prevents us from, as you said, reaching the standard, the quote unquote. And I know I absolutely took your point earlier that this is global, not just America. I focus on America because at the time I'm speaking of my personal experiences, and also because I don't want to misspeak and misrepresent something that's happening in a land that I'm not fully aware of. So I say America, but yeah, it's a global thing, but specifically through my experience here in America, that whole idea of, work hard and you can attain the American dream is BS. That's what it is. It's impossible for some people to attain the American dream, whether they're working hard or not, because there's 50 million obstacles purposely placed in the way of reaching that goal. Yeah. So that's what's, that whenever I hear assimilation and policy, like that's always on my mind. And I hope that people are aware, and if they're not aware, that they're willing to become aware.
Now, you've just touched on one of the frustrations I have about just that discussion of assimilation and policy. Because, and maybe you two have heard me say this before, what are you going to do about it? And so as an example, I know for myself, I had to stop being the person who, yeah, I get it, I understand, and I complain, to what am I doing to change this? And school one is a great example. And I got involved in school boards and school committees, and those were opportunities to raise the issue of, well, how come if you're a Black student, you can't bring in a pick to comb your hair because you deem that a weapon, but yet somehow a comb, which to me could be made just as weaponry if you want, is okay, But if you're not in those meetings, if you're not doing something to take this awareness to the next level of challenging the policy, then it doesn't change. And, one of the things I'm also been involved in is I just moved to Kinderhook. And, Kinderhook is a rather conservative town. And, we were kind of just talking the other day about some of the things that are happening. And it finally dawned on me that, well, I could certainly sit around and talk about them, or I could do something about them. So I got a hold of some people. I've been attending the town board meetings. We have actually raised an issue that we are pushing through the town board, forcing an investigation of things. But it just brings me back to this whole idea of, yes, policy and assimilation and power, but what are you going to do about it? And, and I accept the idea that we're all at different places, but if we don't do something, it just continues.
I absolutely agree with that. I think, though, that we have to absolutely keep in mind as well, which was to my point, that a lot of people don't even know that these policies exist because it's not affecting their day-to-day life. And unfortunately, for humanity, a lot of times we don't care about things until it's affecting us. And so we just don't know. And so I think that there's a lot of people who don't know that they're like, now some of these things are coming to light. And I hope that I've seen that people are starting campaigns and doing work through social media or doing work through their own individual communities. But for the purpose of this podcast, I think there are so many people who don't even know that that's a policy. I don't think that there are a lot of people in the world who understand that something as simple as your choice to wear your hair a certain way can prevent you from graduating high school. And so
that's what I'm talking about. What are you going to do about it? Like, for example, I got very involved in the unions at the state. And, people would complain, well, let's bring it up in the union meeting. And literally there were ahas. They didn't know about it. And they didn't know about it till we brought it up.
Yeah, but I think that's the reason.
And that's what are you going to do about it?
But that's the reason for bringing it up here, though. To me, that is doing something about it. That is making the people who are listening to this podcast who may not be aware become aware. And then encouraging them, as Janice and I have always done on this podcast, as far as as long as I've been involved, is to encourage action. That's our whole purpose in doing this particular podcast. And in this particular conversation, it's, if you don't know, here's that issue. Here's me letting you know. So now that you know, we then, and I don't know if we'll do it on this podcast, but I know that in previous ones, we've actually laid out action steps, which I'm sure we'll get to, maybe not right now, and because we're so early in this part of the journey about being anti-racist. But knowing Janice the way I do, there will be a segment on what will we do about it? What's the next step? How can you turn what we've talked to you about in these podcasts into actual action steps? So I absolutely know that that's coming.
Well, I beg to differ with you for a moment. I think we have been talking about action steps all along. Yeah. I mean, just in this last discussion, we're talking about go to the school board.
Yeah, I mean, laid out like, here's some, very clearly said, listening to this conversation, I hope anybody, can figure out what it is they can do. But Janice and I we definitely have these segments where we say, here's what you can do and here's how you can do it. And I think, Henri, I remember we even used you for one of those types of conversations in the past where we laid out, if you wanted to file a claim against, when you had the racism case against the school, these are some of the steps you can take, because I can tell you that you need to do something, but because we are on different levels, someone may not know the individual 1, 2, 3. So that's what I mean, is that I'm sure there'll be a specific conversation about 1, 2, 3. This is what you can do, broken down to what my friends always say, the Barney level, broken down to the lowest possible level, so that if there's anybody out there who's really still very, very new to this idea of being anti-racist, that they will have some very easy, actionable steps that they can take. So I don't disagree with you there. We're not in disagreement. I do believe that we've been talking about action all along, but I just mean that we will clearly have an episode where we talk about these are some steps you can take.
Well, what I'm
And
thinking,
correct me if I'm wrong, Janice, because
no,
I'm
no, that's why I'm just quietly listening. No, you're absolutely right. We are kind of talking as we go, but one of the notes I'm making as I'm listening to both of you talk is that what I like doing, and I actually have a couple of them at the end of the episode. Like, here are a couple of very specific things based on
yeah.
we would ask you to think about and or act on. But I am given some of the things that we're saying, it makes me realize that yes, having either a certain amount of time per episode or even
Yeah.
a stop and act episode, right? Where like, okay, we've done a lot of kind of conversation around the learning, and now let's spend 20 to 30 minutes on an interim episode that's very much designed to be kind of a stop and act. And what you're getting is we want it to be accessible regardless of where you are.
Your level.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll definitely do that. So before we kind of get to the end where we even crack a couple of things for folks to think about moving forward, I did want to bring us back because one of the really important things that for me from this part of the learning that's really important is our own kind of individual reflections on this idea of assimilationist, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. But he does something really important, I think, for everybody to, or kind of makes a statement that I think is really important for everybody to reflect on, and it's this. He lays bare what I'm going to call a misconception. The misconception for me, I'm going to take it for myself. He suggests largely, but I'll just take it for myself. Is this thinking that ignorance and hate cause racist ideas, and that racist ideas cause racist policies. That's the typical kind of trajectory, if you will, that we have been on with respect to a root cause of racist policies. The truth, though, that he lays out for us that I think is really important for all of us to consider and to keep in mind moving forward is that the root cause of racist policies is actually the self-interest of racist power. That powerful economic, political, and cultural self-interest is behind racist power. So what that means then is that what he calls powerful and brilliant intellectuals produce racist ideas to justify the racist policies of their eras, to redirect the blame for their eras, racial inequities away from the policies and onto the people. And I do want us to capture, and we'll talk offline about this. I want us to capture the historical timeline pieces he smatters throughout this. When you think about that statement, that over time in history, people in power have produced racist ideas to justify racist policies of their areas. When you look back on the get tough on crime, of the late 80s and the early 90s, and the intentions behind those things, etc. That's a really important piece to consider. So I wanted to lay it out there because I think that it's something we're probably going to come back to a lot, reminding ourselves that in the end, yes, I mean, I 100% think ignorance and hate continue to contribute to racist ideas, etc. But the realization that from a historical perspective, racist ideas come from racial power, right? People who seek or are in power and are trying to keep power. And
that's what I was about to say. Yeah, the fight to keep that power. That is, like, I hear it's often when you hear people say, white supremacy, you'll get the rebuttal, but they're not supreme. No, they're not. But it's the desire to keep that position of supremacy, of that, which is the power, which is holding on to the power, legislative power, the judicial power, all of the power that affects the policies of this, of the world. So yeah, I think that's a very strong, distinguished point.
Well, that's where you tie in the social construct, the power construct. I mean, as you were talking, one of the things that popped in my head, and I think in his book, but I know other books reference Ronald Reagan, was very significant in the shift in our country.
Yep.
And I don't know if you two are old enough to remember this. I'm a little older than you two, but if you go back and look at and read, oh my God, he was very significant in a lot of these shifts in our country, to include, remember the whole welfare mama
Yes.
queen thing? He kind of, so he now attaches welfare fraud, taking advantage to Black women.
Yep.
I don't think that's ever going away.
Nope.
Yeah.
Nope.
That's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about, Henri. And he does, when he makes those connections to like just exactly what you said. In fact, the thing I wrote down in my notes was back in the early 80s, the kind of intentional emphasis on this idea of Black on Black crime. And he talks about that, you know, the idea of Black on Black crime shame overshadowing the Black is Beautiful movement, right? That we became so focused on that that we stopped putting our energy toward the positive.
You know what the shame of this is, Janice? And I'm sorry to jump in, is the number of Black people who actually bought into that crap.
Bingo.
And have come to realize we were hurting our own families.
Bingo.
You know, we bought into this shit about let's lock them up. And now we see the impact of taking away fathers and mothers and impacting our community.
Absolutely.
And that was the shame. That's the assimilationist piece.
Yes.
You know, they brought it about. Many people bought in, and here's the outcome. I'm sorry for jumping in. But
no,
yeah.
you needed to, because that is such a huge point and a very clear example of what we're talking about. The one that keeps hopping in my head too is the war on drugs. Let's declare a war on drugs, but only after we push the drugs into the communities that we want to start a war with. So let's give Black communities drugs. Let's get them hooked. Let's make them dependent upon drugs, either selling or using. And then after we've done that, let's now declare a war against the very people we've used these drugs against or given these drugs to, and make them the bad guys. And those are very clear examples. That's an absolutely brilliant point. Absolutely.
Yeah, we have Iran-Contra, you know, and we all know they were pushing crack cocaine, selling weapons. I mean, that's all been documented. And then we have the next president pardon all the people who were involved. I mean,
and blame the people who were recipients. Like let's lock up the people who we gave the stuff to, but not lock up the people who were giving it.
Well, that was one of the most moving parts of it for me, Henri, reading about him talking about his own parents, right? And being able to look back now and realize that his own parents bought into this idea of what he calls, hold on, let me grab it. I'm gonna get it. There he goes. That his parents bought into this idea that the same idea, if you combine education and hard work, you will be successful. And oh, by the way, anybody who isn't successful, it's because they were deficient ghetto Blacks, right? Like,
yes.
It's so it's that it's a choice, right? That this is just you made a choice.
And Janice, we even hear that today. Like, I think about the Colin Kaepernick situation, where the first rebuttal to that is, but he's rich. He's not affected by racism. He hasn't experienced racism, all because he has money. Like, no, people really think that if you just work hard and you just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that you don't, like, racism goes away. And that's ridiculous. Like, there's case after case after case after case where even the wealthiest people have been, beaten by police, have been stopped and, pulled over, and because the police didn't know they were wealthy stars, treated them like crap. So it's so interesting to me that even though what I find most interesting is even white people in this country don't have the ability to just work really, really hard and become wealthy. Like, it's not a realistic idea. And it's like our system relies on there being these class systems, and it relies on the 1% maintaining the power and the wealth, and the rest of us scrambling to get it, scrambling to get it, scampering around trying to become wealthy. But white America has bought into this idea that somehow they can be the Donald Trumps of the world with the money and the power, even when it's those people who are putting the policies in place to keep even them at the bottom rung of the ladder.
Yeah.
So yeah, that idea that, and for Henri to say, like, for Black people, it's a real struggle, because oftentimes we are the ones who have bought into the BS and are perpetrating it, who are perpetuating it is the word, I'm sorry, perpetuating that idea. And so in effect, holding our own selves down from, and so it's that vicious circle that we are even still trying to break.
It's funny that excerpt you read. I was literally in the car listening to that, and right after that, this vision popped in my head, and I said, imagine starting a race. You have the most technologically upbeat Nike sneakers that they just produce, and you gave me some old Chuck Connors that you found in the closet, shoelaces are kind of ripped up, tied together. And we're both pretty equal, but yet somehow when I lose the race, you blame me.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Exactly right. So that's exactly, you guys, we're coming up on the end of our time, but this is perfect because that's exactly the kinds of misconceptions I think we're all here to change, right? And to call out and to change. And we're using Kendi's book as a frame of reference for the conversation. And I appreciate it because it brings so much of the historical context. We've referred to the Reagan era, for example, et cetera. And I do think there's an episode in there where maybe we just focus on that timeline and really kind of pull some of those threads through for people. Because I know I get caught up in all the reading and the listening and the watching that I'm doing right now to better inform myself. And I just think in my head, everybody has the same information and they don't. So, our charge is to, as you said, Melissa, is to bring it to people. But I think, ultimately what we're here to do is to really call out and change some of those, all of those misconceptions, right? One by one by one. And it can be overwhelming because it gets really charged, but I think we can, I think we can slow that down and do it in a way. And, Henri, you just gave a great analogy, right, of the race and just make people kind of think differently about, right? If I'm someone who has always bought into the idea of work hard and you'll be fine, right? Then what we bring to the table is an opportunity to say, well, think about that for a second, right? What are the barriers that exist that you've never even acknowledged or had to think about? I saw, there's a million of them, but I saw a great quote, I think it was on Facebook the other day, because still, so many, and I would wager a guess it's the majority of the population struggles with this idea of white privilege, and we're not going to dig into that today, but this quote was so great because it was so simple, and it simply said, it's not that being, oh gosh, now I got to remember correctly. It's not that my life was easy. It's that the color of my skin didn't make it harder. Yep. It's like that, right? Like that right there. That's as simple as it can get, right? That's exactly what it means. And I think we can keep bringing that. So here's what I'm thinking. Here's what I'm going to charge folks with. First off, what we would encourage you to do from today is reflect, especially on this idea of assimilationist ideas and beliefs, etc. But day to day, check yourself with that, right? And both Melissa and Henri gave some really powerful, just kind of real life examples, right? Check yourself with that. When you're just simply having a thought about somebody else around you, check yourself, right? And ask yourself, where is that thought coming from? If I'm wondering, why are they letting their kids behave like that, right? Why are they dressed that way? Why are they whatever? Check yourself and ask yourself, where does that come from? Why are you even asking that question, right? What is that about? So that's the first thing I would encourage people to do. And then we've referenced a lot about policies, and I know that word makes people think of big things that are beyond me. But what you're hearing from everybody today is there are policies in your day-to-day life. If you are tied to a school, if you're tied to a church, if you're tied to a place of work, if you're tied to a community organization, your day-to-day life is influenced by policies. What we're asking you to do is think about them, right? And when things show up in front of you, ask the question why. Why is that policy that way? Where does the belief that it's based on come from? And what do we need to do about it? The answers to those questions really are, they come from racial misconceptions, right? Um, and then I think for us, following the next steps from our planning perspective, we'll be having a conversation about, like I said, some of those kind of larger policies of historical pieces, and certainly even being even more specific about the call to action. But those are the couple of call to actions that I would encourage people to think of today. And I'm going to come to Henri first, and then Melissa to wrap us up. Henri, what do you think?
Yes, yeah. So just a quick thought, and Melissa, you actually made me think about this as I'm listening to this wrap up. And you're so correct. It is such an unconscious thing, and because I was thinking about this talk, and I said I even find myself sometimes falling back into the trap. I'll give you an example. One of the things, he was talking about is this whole idea of attributing behavior to race. If you're Black, you must have these qualities, or you're good in sports, or if you're Asian, you're good like that. And we know that's nonsense. It's really about opportunity and resource. And yet the other day we were doing something, and I found myself making that old comment about Black people and dancing, and I know that's nonsense, but it's so ingrained in you that you still find yourself at times needing to even check yourself. Like, oh yeah, I need to not continue to think that way. So it is something, when you talk about awareness, it's a twofold thing, and it's really about always thinking about your own awareness, because it is such an unconscious thing at times.
And I think if we're doing that, Henri, we're going to really realize, oh, wow, like the frequency with which you find yourself thinking things about people around you. And if you actually consciously are trying to stop yourself each time, it's going to be really interesting to see what people take away from that, right? Their realization about, like you said, falling into the trap. Melissa, what you got for us?
Yeah, I would just like to say that, Henri, you're absolutely right. And I think that for the three of us, we're pretty self-aware, or at least we're taking the steps to become that way. And yet we're still on that journey. And it reminds me of something that Janice said back on an older podcast from something she read, and I can't quote it, I apologize, but it was along the lines of, you don't take a shower or a bath once and you're clean forever. And this work is the same. Like, you don't just come, I'm no longer racist, and I never ever have to worry about racism ever again, because it is ingrained in the policy, because it is what we have done and known and thought and believed our entire lives. Those thoughts are absolutely going to creep in. For me, the prime example is, and I mentioned this, I don't know if it was in our planning session or the last one, but I went through this really long phase where I felt like I always had to be at my absolute best to the public eye. I couldn't show anger, or I couldn't be lustful, or I couldn't be ignorant. I couldn't make crazy jokes, because I had to be the face, the type of Black woman that countered every other stereotype of Black women. I catch myself doing that even now, even being aware that it's nonsense, and that I'm human, and that I'm entitled to feel all the things that feel and express all the things that other women feel and express. But I still catch myself saying, you don't want the world to see that. You can't show the world that. And so I then have to make a conscious effort to show the world that, because that's what makes me human. So you're absolutely right in that, Henri, that it is. And I think that's the perfect way to wrap up this show, that it is ongoing and continuous work. And as daunting as it may feel, it will be for the rest of our lives, until race is no longer a thing, which I think we are a very long way from. So people have to buckle in for this journey, because we ain't going nowhere. It's not gonna stop. It's not stopping anytime soon. So we have to do that day to day. Like Janice said, check yourself. So I think the last thing I want to say in terms of an action step is to, number one, have conversations with people of different groups that you may not. If you're in a church and you have members of a different group that you don't talk to them. And I'm not saying walk up to them and use them as an encyclopedia on race or of one or the other. Have everyday general conversations. Because if you get to know people, you then understand that we're people. We're just people. So take that time. And then when it comes to your schools or your church, ask about the policies. Be proactive in asking whoever is in charge of those things. Hey, what's the school's policy on XYZ? Hey, what's the church's idea on XYZ? Because then you're not just waiting for an issue to pop up, which then makes it harder to fight something. You can actually go into it well informed and know, like, look, I kind of take an issue with that policy. Can we have a meeting, or can we sit down and talk about why that is the way it is? So being proactive, I think, proactive in the small sense of getting to know people that are different from you for whatever reason, whether it's color, whether it's age, whether it's, their beliefs, having conversations with people so that we make that human connection instead of the separation, and then making that action being proactive to educate yourself.
Melissa, thank you.
Ditto.
Yep, perfect. I love it. All right, and I can't think of a better way to wrap up. So folks, you have your charge moving forward from this conversation. Next week, we're going to actually move into some more of the kind of history timeline pieces. And then also, and I'm really interested because I haven't read ahead yet. I know Henri has, but the next part of the book, Kenny actually gets into the ideas of biological racist and biological anti-racist. And so you're going to start to see a pattern, right? That we're going to talk about those new ideas, new to me at least, ideas, and then dig a little bit into the history around that to understand it. So, because I think what we're trying to get at here is if we can understand where ideas come from, where racist ideas are rooted, then we stand a chance in changing them, right? And I love what you said, Melissa, and I'm going to say, we're not going away. The conversation's not going away. The work is not over in our lifetime, likely. And so, in my head, I hear that people saying, oh my gosh, are you still talking about this? Yes, because we're still so far away from really being a community or a society or a country of anti-racist, right? Which is what this conversation is kind of called to do. So that's where we're going to go next time, folks. And of course, we encourage you to like and share and subscribe and do all the things around this conversation, and then join us next time and we'll get to it.